Thank you very much. And I will now return to our beautiful Hungarian mother tongue. It is with respect and love that I wish to welcome you, all of you, and I am very hopeful that you will all leave this hall with a very positive experience and you will conclude that it was worth your while to spend these 1.5 days together.
As for the title of my presentation, Societal Challenges and Punitive Policy, I'm going to go on a little bit from what the professor said, and I'd like to close the theoretical part of this 1.5 days and then leave the floor for discussion. What I wanted to say about the past 1.5 days in the way of introduction and also as a conclusion, and to explain what we were led by when we put the professional program together, and I hope we managed to achieve that, then we would have highlighted our criminal code. Well, that was the idea. So we wanted to show to our dear guests what kind of criminal policy reasons and justifications there were behind the birth of the new criminal code in 2012. And we also wanted to show you, and the representatives of the profession held their presentations yesterday also, to show you how practice works through their eyes and how these criminal policy targets are being met and how successful in this sense the methodology was, the content-related connection system that is behind the criminal code and has been dominating changes in the past period. There are two very important controls behind pieces of legislation: a constitutional control, and Agnes Cine, constitutional judge, tried to explain this through the actual cases they have on hand. And on the other hand, we also heard the control of representatives of science like Mihály Tóth or Zsolt Szomora explained earlier today, with a certain element of criticism. And then, of course, we must not forget about the fact that there are some special key topics that overlap with some international aspects and are also confirmed by international developments. And these are the topics that are also important to Central and Eastern European countries in particular. So we heard about those topics earlier today. But behind the framework, there is an international environment, our strictly taken region. And when, after the regime change, the legal regulation started, well, we obviously started looking to the West. And quite often we also look at US literature. And somehow the group of neighboring countries that we have a lot of joint experiences with is somehow declining, not only from a societal point of view, but also a legal point of view. And then there is the international environment, the EU, and the underlying society with all the challenges and difficulties it faces, and also the political, economic processes behind the society that Madame Professor Kerezsi also referred to. This all shapes our perception of the criminal code and the constructive criticism we can formulate, and it also determines the way forward and which way we should be walking. What made it particularly special for us during this event is the participation of our foreign guests and how they contributed to our joint experiences. Because as we could just hear, well, for several decades we were part of the same family with some looser or tighter links towards the Soviet Union. And obviously there are social, political, value-related and other consequences to this that are still seen in post-socialist countries and their day-to-day lives to this day. And then we had the regime change and the shock it caused. And I'm going to talk only very briefly about this and what did this mean. It was a society that was built upon the concept of full employment, but often with an obsolete underlying economic structure. So it was this kind of group that we had to build on the new economic reality. And by the time the new system was set up, we forgot our previous experience from the pre-communist era. So it was not that easy for the country in general and its institutions to find answers to the challenges we faced. So then we all joined the European Council and the European Union. And since then, there have been added expectations on the international scene for all countries. I think it's very important to highlight one aspect. I'd like to add on to the message of Professor Kerezsi and look into whether there is a unique criminal policy answer to these challenges and whether we have some kind of shared area that could actually add to the evaluation of this particular domain. Well, there is one impact that still remains from the time when we were part of the same big family. It's something that was in existence for several decades, which concerns independence, self-care, self-sufficiency, which are traits that were not desirable during the communist regime. And I quoted Professor Gönci when she said that the socialist era weakened all types of social cohesion and it didn't motivate the creation of new ones at all. So there was the so-called caring state and we expected answers from the state and we existed in the position of a minor child. We could only move within a permitted framework, but nothing encouraged us to be self-caring or self-sufficient. And the previous community activities that had characterized society before disappeared. The role of the family also greatly changed because, indeed, although the scenery of reproduction or the location of reproduction remained in the family, but all of the other relevant values like passing on values and bringing up children in the family were undesirable features as the state provided childcare in line with the expectations prevailing at the time. And let me also quote another big name, Zsuzsa Ferge, who said that family was actually identified as an institution, an introvert institution that could only meet new expectations by losing old values. And parallel with this, there was also a change in the roles of the two sexes, as with the employment of women, an economic necessity was met, but it also truly reorganized the traditional roles of the sexes that had been dominant before. So there was also a social psychological aspect to the era of the regime change, which is very unique and special from many different aspects. If we look at the history of mankind, then we can say that whenever there was a regime change from the Middle Ages to more advanced stages of development, they took not years but many decades. And societies progressed step by step, and sometimes society took the lead as opposed to economy or the other way around. But we had the time to go through this process in a mature way. But this time, at the time of the regime change in the socialist era, we had 10 to 15 years to cope with all aspects of change, whether it's political, economic, or societal. So all of the institutions, all aspects of society were subjected to this process at the same time. So it was a shock-like change that also had some negative connotations, beyond the fact, of course, that nobody doubted that overall walking on the path of democracy was a wonderful thing to do, but undoubtedly there were difficulties. If you look at the social and psychological implications, the first question has been raised about a feeling of security. And I'm not talking about public security right now. I'm talking about existential security. And as to how equal members of a society are. And the reason why I brought this so-called Gini index, because it shows social inequalities very well. And it might be that before the regime change, Hungarian society's standard of living was worse than in Western Europe, but it was pretty much standard for everyone. There were no marked differences, the kind of differences we have seen since the regime change. And I'm showing some details here because this index shows that full equality is achieved when the index is 0, and when the value is 100, then there is total inequality. And we can see that before the regime change in Central and Eastern European countries, the inequality ratio fell far behind the EU 15. I used EU 15 because that's what's featuring in the statistics, so the definition doesn't matter that much. But we compare now with the EU 15 average. But after the regime change, what we see is that these values have changed significantly. And in Estonia, for example, the situation deteriorated by 45%, Slovakia maybe 32%. I cannot really read the figures from here. So there was a negative change, and practically every single Central and Eastern European country saw the gap widening between the rich and the poor, so hence the major differences. So what really influences our feeling of security is the otherwise positive process of human rights coming to the forefront. But that also means that, well, how to put this? Certain negative mechanisms also became visible, and the operational practices of certain institutions were significantly influenced by what people can do from a human rights point of view, and that is particularly true for the police force. And when a policeman, in Hungarian literally guardian of the peace, does not act with the right approach, then that causes a loss of confidence. So such a loss of confidence also started towards state institutions. And then the institutional caring state also changed, because beforehand the state made all the decisions, providing general employment, and perhaps not quite the quite same standard of living as in Western Europe, but an equal standard of living. So that was no more true after the regime change, and or at least the state struggled to meet these expectations. And together with that, we have another important change happening. Well, before the regime change, unemployment was not really there in society because the government strived for full employment, and in certain periods there were even sanctions imposed on people who did not take up employment. But after the regime change, the unemployment ratio grew significantly, which I showed you on the previous chart. And those who lost their jobs stayed on their own with this traumatic value. So they couldn't share this issue with everyone because everything was blamed on the individual, and it was said that, okay, your competencies are not sufficient, you are not modern enough, you are not trained enough, you cannot meet the new expectations, or you don't speak languages, so there is something that you are missing, a hiatus. So individuals were left alone with this negative feeling, and they didn't have the kind of strong functioning family that had traditionally been there offering a protective shield. I realize I only have 5 minutes. So there were many issues and dysfunctional aspects. Just one more point on this state, and the Madame Professor also wrote about it in many different forms. So in my judgment, and I don't know what the Madame Professor thinks about it, but it was not about not having norms. We still had norms and we still had law, but the kind of confirmation was missing from behind. These norms became hollow, or there was parallel content coexisting next to each other. And then the accession to different institutions also had a societal impact. And here you can see how much individual countries supported and agreed with the given country joining new trends. But let's look at the societal and psychological implications as well. So the loss of trust was continued. And now we lost trust in EU institutions because many in Hungary expected that after our accession we will have a different quality of life and we will be given a certain degree of defense against being totally exposed to globalized markets. And these results never materialized, but there were also other implications. When it comes to the justice system, trust was also lost, and international research for Central and Eastern Europe shows that while in Western Europe the trust in the justice system is at 73% of citizens, so 73% of citizens have trust in the justice system, and in Central and Eastern Europe the same ratio is 1/3 of the population. So how can we expect people to keep to the law, the decisions of the court and the measurements of the authorities if we don't even believe that they work in a lawful manner or if there is any benefit in their operation? That disappointment is also there from a different aspect, and the media added a lot to that. For example, they distorted news about certain crimes that are obviously negative in themselves. And I left this part in English as to what citizens think. Well, as you can see on the right, citizens of Central and Eastern European countries felt least safe and more than half of them felt less safe than in the preceding period. It's only 1 minute. So when we are talking about criminal policy answers, then these answers assume that they take into account the society and the environment that they were born in, and they need to respond to these aspects appropriately. But when it comes to answers offered by criminal policy, well, if we hope that these policies will also resolve some issues, although that's not a job for criminal policy or criminal law, well, obviously human rights issues are of great relevance here. And what I would have concluded my presentation with is that if we look at the evolution of human rights, we can say that the General Declaration of Human Rights was the last stage of development, and in the second stage the process progressed along certain benchmarks like identification with a certain gender, etc., or the age also mattered. And of course, we focused on young people up to the age of 18 because the New York Child Protection Convention also focuses on that. And although criminal law is not responsible for resolving all issues, but it's certainly responsible for safeguarding basic laws and rights. And if we look at the aged focus approach, the question is how much we can guarantee that defense. And I would have had a direct and indirect definition. Obviously, the classic defense is when based on age, a special criminal status is established, offering defense to people of that age who suffer a criminal attack. But of course, for minor persons, the criminal law in Hungary is very detailed, and we could hear some examples, but when it comes to older age groups, we have some serious shortcomings. And Sándor Vadai, head of the faculty, also wrote a very substantive study on this, which says that age in itself does not offer extra protection. There are many other factors that are required, not just age, that authorize a person to have special protection under criminal law. And the other aspect is when the person appears in the system as a culprit, and there is still room for development for minors here, and especially in larger age groups. And now I'm truly going to conclude by saying that for youngsters, it's a general problem. And this particular conference and the whole Central European cooperation also aims for this, which is to learn from each other, to see the best practices of other countries that share a history, a past with us, which includes factors such as access to right by children, by criminals, when we know that there are significant communication issues at hand, and such communication issues are of such significance, for example, linguistic developmental issues that carry much higher risk for repeat offense than many other societal or environmental factors. We can actually see that 6 to 7% of repeat minor offenders are struggling with this issue. And in any case, minor convicts face serious issues. So how much are we meeting the expectations from a human rights aspect, and how much we can find an answer in the criminal code? And as a last aspect, I would also mention senior people. So what can we do about them? The average age is growing. The state of health is thankfully improving. And old people are much more active in society than before. And in that context, there is also a risk that older and older people become criminals. And to show you some international data, between 2000 and 2015, the ratio of 65 plus citizens grew twice as fast as in any other age bracket among convicts. We can also see that the rate of increase was 200 to 300%. Among those who are first-time criminals, may have had a criminal past, but they are convicts for the first time. And there is the other big group, as we heard yesterday, those who are sentenced to life imprisonment. These people grow old in prison with special needs, health-related, mental, other expectations. So the question is how we can respond to this. And I believe that we need to find answers not only in national legislation, and we just had a change in the prison legislation, but we also have some serious gaps at the level of the EU as well. So we very much hope that this very creative and fruitful Central and Eastern European scientific cooperation will be able to offer the right answers. So thank you very much for your attention.